This functionality is fairly new to Epicor in that it was introduced in the version of, I think it's 10.1.600. So I want to preference this by saying, as I go along, there may be, depending on your version, pieces that may not work as expected. Because I've noticed, I did some testing across all the versions, and some worked one way, and then you could notice that they fixed some of the issues, and it keeps improving each version. So that's a good mix. And I think this is a direction I think that they are going more because it gives some more flexibility. So the agenda today is I'll kind of show the differences between the legacy kind of BAQ report designer and this new, I'm going to call it the report data definition BAQ report. And then we'll go through some of the the process of creating the report data definition, because there's multiple steps that you have to do. I'll show you some of the BAQs I've already designed. I won't go through any of that, but show some of the advantages there.
You know, a little bit of time that I kept here. I just want to make sure that
we will
get it. I definitely see
we will design the report data definition.
I'm going to submit a claim to the team. I already have a copy of the receipt.
Could everybody go mute, please?
Yeah.
Karen, I think you're muted now. I think someone did mute all and muted yourself, Karen. There you go, Karen.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, looks like someone hit mute all by mistake, and they mute when you do that, you mute the speaker as well.
So again, we'll go through the manual process of designing our report data definition, adding the criteria set to the report data definition. We have to manually create the report styles, create the SSRS report, and then I'll show you a feature that they've added for this report template to get to the criteria and add a menu item, and then I'll explain some that are available with some complex data sets. So just from a comparison of the legacy to the new version with the report data definition, with the legacy you had one BAQ per report. And for the new one, you can do one or more BAQs, or electronic interfaces is another option, so that you can also use those as a data source. Also in the BAQ legacy, the options and filters were added through the BAQ report designer. And with the new BAQ report data definition, they are using parameters within the query. So there would potentially have been more advanced queries using some parameters that I have an example of, like a recursive query, that in order to limit the data, I had it within a query, and I would have never been able to run that under the BAQ report designer. Now the process of creating this report data definition using the BAQs, and I do want to make sure I emphasize, while you are able to add report BAQs, you cannot add report BAQs to existing table data definitions. So it's either you have tables or you have BAQs, electronic interfaces. There's not a cross between the two at this point. So if you are building one, you have to build one from scratch, basically, even if you want to replicate an existing report. So you can define report requirements, and you will create your data sources and they can be BAQs or EIs, EIs being electronic interfaces. You create your report data definition by defining those data sources. You can create relationships between those data sources, but you don't have to if you don't need to. And then you also create a criteria set. That criteria set takes those parameters from your BAQ and maps it to the report. You then manually create your report styles, and then it has a function to be able to create your SSRS report, and you can then design your actual report, and I'll show you also how the user criteria is passed along to the report, and then you basically add it to the menu where you can run it. Just wanted to mention that my demo is in version 10.2.500. So again, if you're on an earlier version, it may not work exactly the same. There are sometimes in some cases, there's some extra steps. I do have a summary kind of at the end about where some of the differences are. So to get to the next step is I'm going to go to my VM environment, and I'm going to show you a couple queries I've already defined, and to show you how these criteria work within this. So within the query, I have defined my parameters. And in this case, I defined on this query, my order head query, which is basically just pulling information from the order head and some related tables. I'm limiting it to my order number is one parameter, a date. I also did a customer list, which is an item list, so that would become a filter option. And then I also did a ship via, and this ship via is tied to this query to get the values. So just to show running this query, when you run the query, these parameters pop up at this point. So I can, in the way this is designed, I'm saying the order number is greater than this, an order date greater than or equal to this. I'm going to skip the customer list at this time, and I'll assign this as UPS ground and just return the values. And you can see that I only return the things that match that criteria. All orders are since 5/1, only UPS ground. You know, and if I change this and change the date to 19, I'm going to get several more options. Now to show the secondary query that I've done with this, very similar in that all I have though in this case is the order detail, and I've created a couple parameters. I did a radio option for one of these to show that it basically converts it to a drop down. So the order num is working the same as on the other query. And then on this kit flag, I did a radio button set, but this radio button set basically gets converted to a drop down. And I was talking about certain situations, and I have another query I wanted to show while I was at it. This is an advanced query that, because of the way it's defined and it's a recursive query, which is a little bit complicated, it passes a parameter early on. So this one would have never been able to be ran in a BAQ report designer because this part num's passed along early enough that it wouldn't have worked. So this gives the advantage of having the option to do more advanced queries past parameters through kind of earlier stages to limit the data to make it work in subqueries. So basically limit data in subqueries as well. Which you could, the only option under a BAQ report designer would have been a limit on the final query. So let me then go to, we're going to create a report data definition is the next step. So I have the queries. And to do this next step, you have to actually create your data definition. So I'm going to call my data definition, I'm just going to call it KMT order. Well, or not that one, because apparently I'd already done that one. So let me try this again. And you'll define the report type for a SQL Server report. So I have a blank data definition that I've created. This is where I'm going to say I want to add a BAQ. Here's where I will define my first query. And I usually give it a sequence. However, I will not reuse this name for my report query name. One of the couple things that are required is that they have to be what's called CLS compliant. So I cannot use this dash in the name. I cannot have this information start, it needs to start with a letter, capital or lowercase, it doesn't matter. Not start with, and there are certain characters, and I have on this subsequent characters can be letters, numbers, or an underscore. So don't use other characters either. Another little thing that I don't think they have resolved yet is that they have the parent-child relationships don't always feed through to the report correctly at this point. But I found my workaround. It looks like it does it through kind of somewhat of an alphabetical order. So considering that order detail is before order head, it would make the order detail my primary table with the order head being my secondary table. And that's not how I wanted it. So in order to help on that, I will create this with a name like, just make it A order head. Because I can't use numbers, but doing an A, and when I add my detail, I'll set it to a B, and it'll make that parent-child relationships when they're created in the data set on the report what I'm wanting them to be. So that's just a little trick that I have found that will work right now. And I'm going to order another. And this one I'm going to call B order detail. And that adds my two data sets. And actually I did this wrong. I'm going to have to delete this because I didn't catch it and did a dash. And that would cause an error. So let me add that again. Now, relationships, if you've worked with report data definitions, you know if you've added a table, you might have to build a relationship to pull that in. I'm going to do the same thing here, is to build a relationship between the order head to order head and my child being the order detail. and add my relationships here being the always do my company, and then all I have to do is my order num. And you can tell these are actually, because you have the underscore, these are the output from the queries. So that creates my relationship. And if you do not create a relationship between the tables, when the SSRS report is generated, it will create two separate data sets. So there may be cases where that's desired. So let's say you're pulling completely opposite type of information that don't come together at all. Maybe you're doing a executive report that summarizes some order information and some PO information and production information. All those, maybe they're not related, so you pull each one separately and create tables, data sets within the report that are separate, that then you can build separate tablets results for each data set. But in my case here, I wanted to create one. Now the next step is I'm going to create this report criteria set. You can create more than one report criteria set. You can define a default report criteria set. Typically, I've done just one at this point. But I can see situations where you might want to set default values for certain ones, and you can do that in certain situations, and that would allow you to give more options. I just define my report criteria set as the default. I'm going to save it. And I'm going to go to this criteria mappings. This criteria mappings are going to show all my parameters from my queries just in a display. And it can automatically create the prompts. It will not create the filter. So this customer list, which is a filter, I will have to manually create and assign. But I can pick my order date, my order num, my ship via, and my kit flag and create those. Now, if you notice, I'm not going to add my order num for the detail because I don't want the order num on there, but do two different prompts for the order num. I will be able to take my prompt that is created and assign it to my order detail parameters. So I'll show you that. But once I've selected the 4 that I want to create, I can say create report criteria prompt. And if I come back over here, you can see it created my prompts. I can rearrange them if I want to. So move that one, set that to 1. I want this to be 2. Just change the order if you want. And on these details, I will show how a couple things that they've added. This I think is new for just 10.2.5. This that you have the ability, if you want to set a default value and say you're always going to run this from the 1st of the month. You could change this to say, using these options to the 1st of the month. Or you can leave it blank. If it leaves it blank right now, it defaults to today's date, just the way that is working at this point. And you can see on the ship via, it pulled the same information that was on the query into this. This is only working as far as this part goes in 10.2.500. It was not available prior to that version. So prior to that version, it would just show a text box, which you could then customize it and pull that information in, but just would be extra steps. And then you see on the kit flag, this is what I was talking about, even though it was a radio set in the BAQ, this has translated to a drop-down list. Now I'm going to create my filter for the customer list. And typically with the name of it, typically with the names, you want to leave, do also the CLS compliance. So don't start with a number, don't put spaces in there or dashes, things like that. So, because it will not like it. And only certain fields also will be available for use as a filter, but customer ID is one of those, so I'll use that. Now, I don't want this to be the field too. I'm just going to make it straight customer ID, so I'll change my label. And then I'll go back over here. Now, one thing that I have found is just once I create that criteria filter, it's not immediately available, so I have to do a quick refresh to get that field available. But now I can set for my customer list, I can now set this to a filter and assign it to my customer ID. And then on this order num, that's the same as this order num, I want to pass the same information. I'll set this to prompt and pick my order num for the control. So that gives my prompts and filters to the form. Now you can preview your submission form from here too. So you have a preview submission form. And there is my list. Now, some of the descriptions aren't the best because they come over as parameters and aren't always pretty. So I can fix those by changing the display label in my prompts. But you see I can add my customers as a filter, and then I also have these. So let me go change the names here. So I can change it. Put this spacing in there. Because this is also greater than or equal to, I'm going to add a greater than or equal to so that people do know how that report runs. And then also on the date. Okay. So now when you see this form again, it just looks a little bit better. Again, this the way this works, it does default to today's date. Now we're going to go to the report style piece of it. And I'm going to call this the same name as my report data definition. Now this, when you did a BAQ report, the report styles was automatically created. And in this version, it doesn't automatically happen. So you have to do some steps to get that done. So I'm just going to ID with the same information. Just make it easy. So I create my report style. But then I also have to manually create my style. So I'll just do new. I'm just going to call it standard. I'll change this to SQL. And this data definition by default is the same as a report ID, but you can change it. Then I'm going to save it. Now when I save it, I go ahead and change this to the output location of the database, and I go on and select my report criteria. So this is where I said if you have more than one, you can select which one goes for which report style. But there is no report yet. So at this point, I'm going to, in order to create the report style, I have the action of create SSRS report. like this. It takes a second to create the report. And just as while this is being created, I will note that in 10.1.600, this part does not work. So there's a couple other steps that I note that you will have to take to get that working. And then in a couple others, they don't create the data sets. And that's one of those options where normally you'll hear most of us say, do not do the sync data set. This is one of those cases where I say, sometimes it's easier to do that. Okay, there's the report that was created. So it creates into that custom report. So it'll create a folder and put that in there. And I'm going to go back over to my SSRS so that you can see it's not here at this point, but when I refresh, my report should show in here. Here's my demo order. So here's my folder and here's my report. And it pulls it as a blank report with those data sets attached or created. So you have some report labels. Here's another difference between the BAQ reports and these reports. The BAQ reports would add all of the fields into the data set for the labels. This report does not do that at this point. And I pointed out this user criteria. This user criteria is an XML formatted data of all those parameters that might get passed along to the report will show up in here. And I'll show you a couple things along that. But here's our A order head that was created with the order head with the left outer join to the order detail to get that information. So now this is available to create the report from scratch. Now I didn't want to do that for this because it can take some time to do that. And I have a generic one that I did here. Let's open up. This is very generic, so it's not a pretty report at all, but it's just functional to give you the information that you need. But what I wanted to show you, I put these here to show how to get the user criteria, because they've added some code, and so I can pass this get criteria prompt value, pass along the user criteria from the report parameter table, and here's my criteria name is order num, and return the order num. Same thing with the kit flag and order date. Now with order date, it is as a text. So like with the order date, I had to convert it to a date. So you might have to do some formatting, but the information is there. So it'll return a string output of what that criteria was passed along to the report. And so I have that also included in this so that you have some information there to know how to get the information. So then the next step, we've created a report. We've created the report style. We created the actual, populated the RDL within the SSRS. So the next step is adding it to a menu. And so instead of actually doing that, I just captured a snapshot of this. Now this was the report I did as prep work to make it easier. The program type is a report, and then those reports are available from that. and it's this dynamic criteria report. So I went on and did that to make it easier, and we will run a couple reports. So this is that report that I created the report style for. So I'm going to, this is the default criteria. I'm going to pass along date, and I'll do and I'll leave the should be a blank, and I forgot to mention this on this flag, because it is a required parameter, and I don't think I did it on our data set. I'm sorry, I missed this. I did define the default value as A. Since I missed that, I'll go back and cover that. So now when I do the preview submission form for this one we created, that defaults to all lines, because the A corresponds to all lines. But back to the one I'd already created. One. Here's this, and then I can add a couple customers. Maybe in this case, I'm going to add Addison and Dalton, because I know they have some orders, and I'm going to just preview the report. And I don't think I passed along and put in my output the actual customer name, so we won't be able to verify that. But here's the report that's generated. My not so pretty, but here you can see where it used that criteria to get the information from that XML, and then just the data as we have seen. And then along the same line, I did one on the other one. This is one I would not have been able to do through the BAQ report designer because of a criteria I needed to pass in a subquery. But this is one that, because I can now do it as a parameter, is an indented BOM. Basically, if we think about the way, if you're looking at a method and you look at the view cost, it does something very similar to that, and an indented BOM method of that. So that's an example that I could not have done this type of report through the BAQ report designer. And a couple last little things that I wanted to cover is one of the interesting things that I have found is that if you have an extremely complex data set, or maybe it has an advanced calculation that needs to be done and it's almost impossible to do with the BAQ, you can create an electronic interface. Now, the electronic interface is basically a program that resides on the server that's a C#, so you have to create that file, those program files, create the electronic interface, but that electronic interface can be added as a data source in addition to the other BAQs. So you can have multiple electronic interfaces, or an electronic interface and BAQs. I have a customer where I've done a couple BAQs along with electronic interface, and I can get that information and then use that information to create the report. It can be useful if you're trying to get a lot of information or summarize it, because that was the case in this point, was that the query was just taking too long to run, but I could do it through this method and I wouldn't run into BAQ timeouts also. And then just a couple other notes that I had was just, I made a comment before that the 10.16 would not create the SSRS, so you have to manually create the reports. 10.2.100, it didn't actually create the data sets. It would create the report, but not the data sets. And after that point, the data sets were created. And in some versions, you would find extra tables that maybe, or extra data sets you don't. getting the criteria from the SQL parameters did not occur till the 10.2.500. And then I made a note here because this is valid all the way to now, is that the parent-child logic, it follows more of an alphabetical logic than a sequence or parent-child definition. So keep that in mind when you're building them. So if you see odd results, that might be why. And so now we are open for questions.
I know this can be a little technical for people that haven't created BAQs before, especially since it's a new functionality. But just kind of see if there's any questions before I wrap it up.
We have somebody that looks like raised their hand. I think is what that is.
Yes.
Yes. Can you go to the table relationships portion? I've tried in the past to edit an existing Epicor report, and can you link multiple tables? Like if I wanted to link a part table to part rev and then part rev back to a.
No, that is still not an option. It's still a one table to one table.
Okay.
And that's where you could maybe do it a little bit directly through the query.
Okay. Yeah, I've only ever edited the built-in ones. Yeah. So building the query is probably where you have to sort that out, I guess.
Yeah, you can do it through the query, so that gives you that option there. And again, I want to make sure you can't intermix these. You'll notice here under the options, I cannot add a new table. And just like if I was in a standard, say, order acknowledgement, I can't add a BAQ or electronic interface. So they are not interchangeable.
Looks like Art has a question as well. Oh. It's like he exited. Art, are you on? Did you have a question? Okay. I think Larry has a question. You can unmute, Larry. Okay, got a couple hands up, but people aren't unmuting to ask the questions.
You can always type in the chat too if you want to.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Oh.
A little feedback.
Is that you, Larry?
Yes.
Got some feedback there. Did you have a question?
Well, just how do I create a sub-report?
The sub-reports would be just like working with the sub-report. So you could, let's say I added in here a information for the part bin table and a query for a part bin table. I could put that into a sub-report and process that separately, take that data out of my main report and just leave it in my sub-report and create those links just through the standard process of creating that. You know, you can pass the parameters along from the main report to the sub-report. It gets a little complicated, but you can do that in this case too.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay,